Welcome, everyone. I'm Rebecca Tromble, Director of the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics at George Washington University, and I have the distinct pleasure of opening this conference, The Capitol Coup 1 Year Later, which is jointly hosted by IDDP and the UNC Center for Information Technology and Public Life. The images cast across screens on January 6, 2021, laid bare the fragility of American democracy in a stark and dismaying way. The steps and halls of one of the institutions at the heart of electoral democracy were inundated by a violent mob, fed by a series of blatant lies, political and racial animus. They sought to halt a procedure enshrined in our Constitution and to overturn a freely and fairly run election. 1 year later, it's not clear what, if anything, we've learned as a society. In a moment when we should be all hands on deck to protect and secure elections, democratic institutions, and the rights of all citizens, but with particular mind to protecting the rights of those historically prevented from full democratic participation, we've instead seen political leaders choose inaction. And in far too many instances, those holding political, economic, and media power have made matters worse, continuing the lies, intensifying hostilities, and actively working to undermine democratic rights and processes. I wish I could strike a more optimistic tone to open our conference today, but sitting precisely where I did 1 year ago today, just minutes from the Capitol building, I do not feel particularly optimistic about the state of American democracy. However, what I do feel is incredible resolve. I believe that we as citizens and scholars can play a pivotal role in unpacking what happened a year ago and why, and envisioning a fair and just path forward. That's the purpose of this conference, and that's the work of our first keynote speaker, Dr. Emily Van Duyn. Dr. Van Duyn is Assistant Professor of Communication at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and her research explores why people talk or do not talk about politics and the role of digital media in facilitating a space for community and political discourse. Her recent book, Democracy Lives in Darkness, explores the reasons why individuals do not express their political opinions in public and how they express those opinions and organize in secret. This work is concerned with the effects of social, geographic, and political polarization and how this threatens liberal democratic norms. I personally have learned tremendously from Dr. Van Duyn's work, and I'm thrilled that she's opening the conference for us today. Before I turn over the floor, I should note that we'll have a window near the end of the hour for Q&A. You can submit questions via email for the Q&A to iddp@gwu.edu. And now, without further ado, Dr. Van Duyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that lovely introduction. So I am delighted to be here today with the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics and the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. This past year, my book, Democracy Lives in Darkness, came out. The book starts with the 2017 Women's March and ends with the January 6th insurrection on the Capitol. So it's actually kind of nice to pick up where I feel like my book kind of leaves off and to discuss one of the darkest days, I think, in recent history. But I am trying, I guess, in this talk to take a little bit more of an optimistic tone, to think about how we have some optimism for the future of democracy and the ways that researchers and those who are interested in studying contemporary American democracy might look at it. So I've titled this talk, Democracy in the Dark: How Our Assumptions Have Blinded Us and How to Find Light Again. Because I believe that January 6th is a strong example of the challenges facing our democracy and our study of it. But I also think that January 6th offers us a moment to think about what assumptions and what approaches guide our understanding, and then how we can change those things to get a better sense of where we are in democracy today. So I'd like to start off with two stories. The first story took place almost exactly 1 year ago today. At noon, Donald Trump, the current president of the United States, started speaking to a crowd of supporters outside the White House, encouraging a crowd to never concede the election, to never give up the election. He told the crowd, if you don't fight, you're not going to have a country anymore. As he concluded his comments, a group of protesters stormed the barricades at the Capitol, shattered windows, broke down doors, and forced Congress to adjourn from the meeting that was intended to certify electoral votes and to take shelter. Simultaneously, across the country, similar crowds gathered across state capitals and officials were evacuated. The insurrectionists, as they came to be known, had live streamed, tweeted, and posted themselves in the midst of violence, calling for backup and ammunition. And in one of the Facebook groups where the event was actually organized, one individual posted, if they won't hear us, they'll fear us. I watched from this office, actually, as I was working on my book's conclusion, and I ended up deleting the entire chapter and starting over because this event was so pivotal to what I think we have to say about democracy today. So I'd like to tell you a second story. This story takes place back in time in Texas in August of 2017. If you have ever traveled to Texas in August, you are most likely experiencing flashbacks in the form of a hot flash. If you have never traveled to Texas in August, don't. This August in 2017, I was attending a meeting of a secret political organization in rural Texas, invited for the first time by its members after gaining access and interviewing several of the group's leaders. The group was sitting in a semicircle facing the front. They start their meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance. They read aloud a confidentiality agreement that prohibits members from referencing the group or anyone outside of the group, to anyone outside of the group. Most of the women in this all-female group are Democrats. Some of them are disaffected Republicans. But what the whole group has in common is that they didn't vote for Donald Trump in 2016. Except most of them are in a community, or all of them are in a community that went over 75% for Trump in 2016. And many of them go home to husbands who voted for Donald Trump or work for employers or clients who also voted for Donald Trump. So your question might be, what do these stories have to do with each other, right? How do we have any comparison between these two vastly different groups of people? And my argument today, and my goal in this talk, is to show you that these two stories are actually quite related to each other. And I want to tell both of those stories in depth and kind of prove to you that they are. But what I can tell you now at the very beginning of this whole argument is that both of these stories say that US democracy has changed and that our assumptions about what it is and how we should study it need to change in response. So my goal is not really to talk about January 6th in terms of its buildup and its consequences, but my goal is to really have us look at January 6th and the story of this secret political organization at the heart of my book, how those two things ask us to confront broader changes in our democratic landscape. So I'd like to start out by talking about what happened in Texas and to my study of this secret organization in rural Texas. Then I'd like to talk about what happened on January 6th and what we know kind of more concretely 1 year later. But most importantly, I'd like to talk about what this tells us about democracy, what this tells us about our study of democracy, and what's really at stake for all of us trying to make sense of democracy's future and potentially trying to help it. So to start off, from 2017 to 2020, I followed this secret political group, an organization in rural Texas that I mentioned at the beginning, which I call the Community Women's Group, or CWG for short. The group is comprised of 136 registered members, all of whom are mostly white, middle to older age women. The group has a mission statement, which lists 3 main goals: to support, to educate, and to take action. the group also has a confidentiality agreement. Each member has to sign the confidentiality agreement and agree to it before joining the group. The agreement states three things: that members do not share the name of the group to anyone outside of the group, that they only recruit people who they know well and they know to be of like mind, and that they don't publish anything about the group outside of the group without explicit permission. Importantly, the group was founded using digital media. It used a private email listserv to originally organize people in the community that they thought would be interested. And they also used a secret Facebook group. These tools were actually really, really important to these women because some of them, as I said, had husbands who supported Donald Trump or needed protection from employers or clients knowing about their politics. And so these private mechanisms served as a way to communicate about politics, to have conversations, but also to find one another and organize this organization that really came to be. So my book includes 40 interviews from 2017 to 2018, 25 meeting observations of this group, as well as 6 additional interviews from 2020. I also use US representative and Texas representative survey data to assess the extent to which this is really happening more broadly. And from all that I found in this data, there's really one thing that I want to highlight today, which is that mainstream partisans, average Republicans, Democrats, are afraid. And typically when we think about people who are afraid of expressing their beliefs in a liberal democracy, we might think about people with extreme beliefs, right? Like those on the far left or those on the far right, or those with little social power, right? The historically marginalized. But in the case of CWG that I highlight in my book, we're talking about average Democrats, middle-class white women, two groups of people who in most regards are pretty commonplace and privileged. And as I got to know the women of CWG, I heard their stories and I heard their reasons for forming this secret organization. I started to understand that what motivated them was fear. It was the same social fear, actually, that we've heard from other marginalized groups. So for one, the women feared social isolation. They worried that they would be isolated from people in their community if their politics were to be known. They even used some of the same language of past movements and marginalized communities, particularly around stigma in the LGBTQ community, about navigating the publicness of sexual identities and the phrase coming out. So they talked about coming out as Democrats to their community. So for instance, Virginia, who is one of the members of CWG, told me about the difficulty of being a Democrat in the community, in fact, in particular, in voting in a primary. So in the state of Texas, where there are open primaries, you just declare at the polls which party's primary that you want to vote in. And open primaries were really intended to allow privacy without having to register for a party. But in the case of CWG's county, in this kind of rural location where it's a small community, they were often outed as Democrats to their neighbors when they came to vote in the primary and selected to vote in the Democratic primary. And Virginia says that this is, one of the reasons that actually most of the Democrats in their county vote absentee. Deborah also told me, another member in 2017, told me that she avoided getting into politics because she had been an election judge about 12 or 13 years ago, and that she was shunned by her friends in the community when they saw her working at the Democratic table. And so after that, she says, they didn't speak to me for a while, so she kind of laid low. So these are the kind of social fears, but I also heard a lot of economic fears, right? Fears of economic retribution should people in their community actually know their political beliefs. And in a small community, this was actually really, really consequential. Many of the women owned small businesses, they were real estate agents, and they worried that people knowing their political beliefs as a Democrat or a progressive or someone who didn't support Donald Trump would cost them business. And in fact, on several occasions, the women actually told me that discovery of their political beliefs had cost them business. So Barbara in 2017, who is a real estate agent, said that she actually avoided political discussions altogether because she really couldn't afford to lose clients. She said she had to pick her battles, that sometimes she just sacrificed her willingness to make a point because she didn't want to lose that business. This was also true for Roberta, who owned a local business in town, who said that like if people knew what she thought politically, that there would be, a retribution against or retaliation against her business because of her politics. So the social and economic fear that came with being just an average Democrat in the community was surprising, but the probably biggest surprise for me in my interviews was that the women were not just afraid of social and economic retaliation, but they were also afraid of physical retaliation. Actually being afraid of having a physical attack or some type of physical retribution for a public display of their partisanship. So Linda, for example, in 2017, I asked her, why don't you want to put up a yard sign, or why would you be unwilling to put up a yard sign for Clinton in the 2016 election? She said, well, as far as that goes, that it's just a fear of the unknown. I live in an area where people carry guns in their car, and I have had the experience of having 2 of my animals shot. So having a yard sign in the past had led to 2 of her animals being shot at, and she was not interested in engaging in that type of public display for fear of risk of that same thing happening. When I asked Barbara if she was comfortable putting out a yard sign in 2018 for Beto O'Rourke, who was running against Ted Cruz in the Senate for the 2018 midterms, she said, look, I'm still not going to put out this yard sign. There are people on my road that would shoot it. She was also unwilling to put on a bumper sticker for a similar reason, that she was worried people would try and run her off the road. So what this told me was that this wasn't just a limited social fear of being kicked out of a club or people not liking you, that this had really transitioned into this physical or fear of physical retaliation or retribution for very mainstream normal political beliefs. And because of this fear, the women were really explicit about their secrecy. They enforced this confidentiality agreement. This is the actual confidentiality agreement that was posted at each of the meetings. And many of the members were really adamant that they keep this confidentiality agreement throughout the course of the organization's existence, which is actually still running today. For instance, Anne in 2017 told me she was really adamant that the group stay confidential, not just because of her fear of what the community would do, but she also didn't want her husband to know. So her husband had voted for Donald Trump, and there was some tension within their relationship around that. And so she actually didn't tell him that she was in this group, what the group did, what happened there. He doesn't really know where she's going. And so to her, it was really important to keep it private and a secret in order to minimize that conflict with her husband. Others thought that there might actually be strength in the secrecy of the group, right? So that if Republicans didn't know what they were doing, that they might actually have a competitive edge in making change in the community, that they could avoid Republicans saying that everything that Democrats say is a lie, or that they're the trash of the earth. So that this privacy and this secrecy allowed them some power in terms of being able to affect change without being under the scrutiny of the other party. And the group was also really interested in having this group in the CWG stay confidential because it was different, right? Like if you wanted to be public, if you wanted to be a public progressive or a public Democrat, you could join the Democratic Party. But to the group, this was an alternative. This was a space, a third space where people could engage in politics, but not have to be publicly out there about it. So when I first found this group and I began to publish my results, people were skeptical. I often got a question in the back of the room at conference presentations that something amounted to, how much of this is actually happening? So I wanted to answer that question, and I collected US and Texas representative survey data that asked 2 really important questions. The first question was, how often do you feel the need to hide your political conversations from those around you? And what I found was really striking. 22% of the national US sample said they felt like they needed to hide their conversations or beliefs, at least sometimes. The second question that I asked was how many of this sample had joined a private group to have discussions about politics in secret. And I found that 9% of that sample said they had joined a group within the past 2 years to intentionally to have secret discussions about politics. So what this told me was that CWG is not alone, right? The story of a bunch of middle-aged grandmothers in rural Texas being afraid of expressing their beliefs was not an isolated event, right? That it's representative of a broader trend in American politics, which is this, that people are keeping their politics a secret. So that's the first story. I promised you a second story, and perhaps it's the most relevant to the topic of the day, which is what happened on January 6th. So we've talked about Texas, we've talked about the fear and secrecy amongst these mainstream Democrats, but there's also another story that relates to that fear and secrecy around January 6th. So a year later, we have a pretty good sense of what led to the insurrection, right? What stoked it, how it was carried out. I mean, for one, we know that it was fueled by years of disinformation and potent disinformation in the months leading up to January 6th. So for instance, some recent work by Bailey Bond and Ryan Neville Shepard have looked at how QAnon played a really important role in proliferating election fraud disinformation and discourse that alluded to Trump as a messiah, which helped mobilize his supporters on January 6th. We also know that violence and opposition towards the election results were absolutely stoked by elite discourse, particularly from Trump himself and from right-wing media. So recent work from Catherine Clayton, Brendan Nyhan, Ethan Porter, and others have looked at the role that Trump's statements about fraudulent election results, how exposure to those statements helped to erode trust in institutions and confidence in US election results amongst his supporters. We also know that this focus on populism and elite opposition, it didn't appear overnight, right? This has been slowly brewing for many years. So I'm thinking of research by Khadijah White, who will actually be speaking tomorrow as part of this anniversary event, which documents the rise of the Tea Party movement, absolutely shows how media played into this uncritical promotion of elite opposition, of populism that absolutely related to the push for election fraud in 2020 and really engaged those that participated in the insurrection in 2021. We also know that xenophobia and racism were absolutely central to the insurrectionist attitudes and actions, right? This was symbolic even in their brandishing of the Confederate flag, or the noose that was strung outside the Capitol. And this is something that Rachel Kuo and Alice Marwick of CITAP have noted eloquently in their call for disinformation research that is critical to the experience of race in this country. Those things were absolutely part of that day and were central to the insurrectionist motivations. And we also know, with growing evidence as the trial for these insurrectionists has advanced, that the event was coordinated and it was documented online. Two of the main groups behind the event's mobilization, Stop the Steal and the Patriot Party, relied heavily on private online groups. The goal was to mobilize supporters without detection from platforms. So for instance, there was the Stop the Steal Facebook group, which had over 300,000 members, that was critical to the event's organization. Yet, Sheryl Sandberg, when asked if Facebook played a role in the insurrection, said she thought these events were largely organized on platforms that don't have their abilities to stop hate, don't have their standards, or don't have their transparency. But when we look at the role of Facebook in housing the insurrectionist plans, it's pretty clear that Facebook played a role, right? On the one hand, there's the original Stop the Steal Facebook group, which was created on November 3rd of 2020. It had 300,000 members. It shut down later, but it still had 1 million requests by the time it was removed on November 5th. So that's enough traction to allow people to find one another and to organize other groups. Which makes sense that when we looked just 2 days after the insurrection occurred, that there were 66 mostly private Stop the Steal related Facebook groups that subverted Facebook's attention altogether by using different names in the groups. The company and Facebook claims that they were unable to take down each of these groups because each group individually didn't violate their violation threshold. But what the problem with that is that they didn't consider all of these groups as part of a movement, right? And that when you look at them collectively, they're actually really, really problematic. So some recent work from Craig Silverman and his team at BuzzFeed found that and looked at the report from Facebook that showed that hateful content on these Stop the Steal related groups was huge. 4.11% of group posts on Stop the Steal groups had white supremacist language compared to just 0.13 of all civic groups on Facebook. Even more horrifying, 42.72% of these groups contained violence and incitement compared to just 0.89% of all civic groups on Facebook. So what this tells us is that when we look at these groups collectively, Facebook absolutely played a role in housing these groups, and that they particularly were very much about violence and white supremacy and hate, very different than the other groups on Facebook related to politics. Of course, the only way that we get this data was through the leaking of an internal Facebook report because we don't have access to Facebook data. So what about Facebook's role in all of this? It absolutely had a role, right? Their taking down of one large group did not stop organizing in others, right? Likewise, their treatment of a group as isolated from a broader movement and their reliance on this kind of arbitrary violation threshold makes them bad or even like complicit in stopping movements that are totally centered on violence and hate. And the other thing that this tells us is that people know how to conceal their behavior and beliefs online. These groups learned how to avoid Facebook's attention and to avoid being taken down. They know how to do it, and they do it. Of course, it wasn't just Facebook that helped organize and mobilize the insurrection. There were other platforms like Gab and Parler that were essential to its execution, but Facebook was a very critical player in organizing these people together. Okay, so now that you've heard these two stories, my question for you was, what do these stories have in common, right? How do these totally different groups who have completely different makeup and goals, what could they possibly have in common? How could the story of the secret group of progressive grandmothers, what could that have to do with a group of subversive domestic terrorists who sought to undermine an election? Well, for one, both of these groups are about fear, right? One of them is about stoking fear. If they won't hear us, they'll fear us. And the other is about persisting through fear, right? Of being afraid, but participating and speaking up sometimes anyway. But these stories are also about tools. Both of these groups, the insurrectionists and CWG, they use the same tools, the same private means of communicating, of organizing, right? Private Facebook profile or accounts. Except one of them used these tools for democratic good, and one of them used these tools for democratic harm. So because there are these similarities, I want us to think about, what do these stories tell us? Like, what can they really tell us about our democracy And what can they tell us about our study of it? Well, the first thing I think they tell us is that our common assumption that the US is a liberal democracy is wrong. That there are conditions in this country in which people are harboring fear and violence against democracy, and there are places where people are being silenced out of that fear of violence. For one, threats based on political ideology and beliefs, threats that are violent, are becoming more commonplace. They're happening to average Americans with average political beliefs. I'm thinking of an upcoming book from Nathan Kalmo and Liliana Mason, who kind of further paint this picture of partisan hostility as it has grown over the past few decades in American democracy. And that fear has really changed who is being silenced, right? The members of CWG are not a largely underprivileged population. They are not extremists on the left or the right. They are average mainstream Democrats who fear social, economic, and physical retaliation that has made their secrecy necessary. These aren't people who have anything else against them except for the fact that they're Democrats in a largely dominant Republican area. And that tells us that free speech, this kind of like foundational principle of liberal democracy, one that is absolutely at the center of the current debates around the role of platforms and technology, it's not ubiquitous, it's contextual. Democrats in Austin, Texas are not a political minority that are likely afraid of retaliation, but Democrats in CWG's county are. So if we want to argue about free speech, then we need to think about whose speech and where that speech takes place, in addition to how valuable it is to our democratic good. The second thing that these stories tell us is that our understanding of mainstream political expression is not totally right. That people are not just 100% loud or totally quiet, that there's this third space where people kind of pursue political expression, but in private. So we think about political expression as this kind of total expression or complete silence, but it's really not a fitting categorization for how people convey their beliefs anymore, right? We have more options for communication that are private, largely online, and we have greater risk to that communication. So what that means for us who are trying to make sense of democracy and people and how we engage in conversation around those things, we need to think about how people intentionally conceal their beliefs, what I'm calling political secrecy. And we also need to think about how this is amongst not just extremes, but people in the mainstream, right? People who regularly get a majority of the electoral votes, who in one context are very much silenced and isolated, but in other contexts aren't. And that means we need to think about the role of digital media in facilitating the ease and scale of this secrecy, right? We saw that at work with CWG, and we saw that at work in the insurrection mobilization on January 6th. So this role of digital media isn't equal, right? It's not like it's all used for bad or it's all used for good, but it is a tool that can be used for both. And we need to look at how it facilitates these private spaces and how it facilitates political secrecy. So if that means we need to change our conceptualization of democracy and political expression, then that also means we need to change our approach to studying it. So we tend to focus on public data, right? Public expression. We scrape data from public pages. We look at public groups largely because that's what's available to us. But when we do that, we only get what is publicly said, not necessarily what the public actually feels. So of course, given the constraints of access to data that's imposed by the platforms themselves, this means we have to use different ways of accessing and assessing how people communicate in private. My argument to you is maybe that means we need to ask them questions and we need to listen. Maybe it's not scraping every page or trying to get some type of counted data. Maybe we need to build relationships or access and listen to people in these spaces. It's also important that we advance and celebrate approaches that look at people within their social context. The places where people experience fear and polarization and express themselves, all of those things provide really valuable meaning, right? About their experience of polarization, media, information, and their perceptions of their own beliefs. So as we build a world in which we have multiple communities, in which people are part of multiple communities, and context becomes really important, we need to look at that context as we figure out how people are talking about politics, if people are talking about politics, and how they're engaging in democratic life. It also means we need to use these new approaches to build new theories and new methodologies. We need a new lens through which to evaluate people in politics that aren't dependent on these old assumptions of a democracy. As CWG and January 6th show us, we are not in the same democracy where many of these theories and methods were built from the beginning. We're in a different place. And that means we as researchers need to be thinking about how can we build new theories and methodologies that are responsive to these changes, that aren't trying to use the same lens we've been using decades before. So the last thing I think that these two stories really tell us is that our prognosis for democracy, it's not simple, right? It's not black and white. It's not doom and gloom. It is made complicated by the coexistence of fear and persistence that we see in these two stories of CWG and the insurrectionists. Some scholars want to say that democracy is dead, right? That January 6th and the partisan hostility and anti-democratic violence is evident that democracy is irreparable. Some other scholars say, you know what? It's not that it's dead, it's that it's dying. It's that January 6th is evidence that without major intervention, that we're going to lose the great American experiment, that we have major backsliding happening and that we require huge changes to fix it. But my argument here today is not either one of those. It's that democracy is just in the dark, that we have evidence of democratic erosion and democratic resilience. It's not that democracy is dead, it's that democracy is dark, that the public relies on this darkness to do democratic good, just as it does democratic harm. That the secrecy and the fear that's been built into democracy over the past several years has not just led to bad things, it has in many ways led to bad things, but there are also people that are rising above that. And in some cases, they even use the same tools or the same platforms to do both good and to do harm. So that if we want to know, if we want to help democracy, then we need to look not just at the bad, but we also need to look at the good. How people persist through darkness, not just how they live in darkness. That's what we need to know to get a sense of where democracy stands today. And that means we need to think differently about what democracy looks like in contemporary America. Thank you for your time, and I am happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Emily. Dr. Van Duyn, thank you for this incredible presentation, thought-provoking, insightful, and for indeed pointing us to important private and dark spaces that we need to be investigating further. If we're to develop a better understanding of events like January 6th, and if we're aiming to promote, support, protect democracy, democratic institutions moving forward. A reminder to the audience that if you would like to submit questions for Dr. Van Duyn, you can do so via email. The email address is iddp@gwu.edu. I'm going to start off by offering a few questions that came up in my mind as I was listening to the presentation, and wait and see if we have some additional questions that then come in from the audience as the two of us are talking through some of this. There's so much, right, that we could really dig into here. And in the 18 minutes that we have left, we definitely won't get to all of it. Certainly our hope is that the conference will give us, the larger research community, an opportunity to dig into many of these important questions and beyond. But I'd like to highlight a few of the things that I was particularly struck by. The first of those is the really stark and I think important statement that free speech is not ubiquitous, it's contextual. And you noted that we need to think about whose speech is implicated when we're looking at questions of free speech. So my question for you, Dr. Van Duyn, is how do we do so? What's the starting point? Or crucially, what are the analytical tools, whether it's theoretical, methodological, or otherwise, that we need to use in order to think about the conditions that contextualize free speech?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, something that strikes me in all of the conversations about digital media and technology and its role in democratic life is that we always come back to free speech. It's like platforms are obsessed with that as a reason, and it's kind of cherished as this most important democratic value. And it is, right? It's so central. But I think we need to get a sense of where free speech is threatened. It's not just threatened on platforms, and we could go down a whole rabbit hole of talking about that, but it's threatened in communities, like as we see with CWG, right? Like these are pretty normal, privileged people who feel afraid to express their beliefs. And that 100% matters about where they are. If they were living in some other social context or in some other community, maybe it wouldn't be a big deal that they were Democrats. And so one of the things that I think that pushes us as researchers to do is so often we like to think about, we just strip context from where people are. We don't look at their community. We don't look at them as like a person embedded within some type of network, right? And I think that that's potentially increasingly important that we do, because that network and those communities create a situation either of encouragement and mobilization, or it creates a situation of risk and silence. And so to know whether someone is, in the minority, or whether they're feeling isolated or they're feeling silenced, we have to look where they are and who is around them and who's important to them. And so I think that means, as I mentioned, listening. It's hard to know what matters to somebody without talking to them. We can't possibly get a really good idea of people's social context if we don't ask questions about the communities that matter to them. And that means maybe less just data and more data as listening and engagement.
It sounds like things like deep engagement through ethnography and oral history could be particularly valuable here.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that actually provides a perfect segue to one of the first questions that we received from a member of the audience. This is from Professor Mike Wagner, who has written to ask what sort of advice you would give scholars for building relationships with groups that might be engaged in secret expression when that expression is antithetical to our own views about how democracy best works, or even our own particular general political ideologies. So putting it in other words, among many other wonderful things that you've done, you've provided a really interesting blueprint for the study of secret expression of groups that are not a danger to democracy. But he's wondering what we might do to study groups that we think might actually be antithetical to democracy, or we even simply just disagree with, in particular, how we might do that safely.
Yeah, I think this is a growing concern because I think academics in many ways feel limited by who will talk to them. And it is, right? Like so much of this is about building relationships and getting people to trust you. I absolutely had to do that in the case of studying CWG. It helped that I am a white lady with a background in democratic politics. So that certainly helped get me into the room. And I think that is a challenge to build relationships with people potentially who we see as subversive or problematic, or people we just disagree with. And so I think that's a great question. I think trust is really essential. Relationship building is really essential. I think for the most part, people don't want to feel like you're going to just expose them. And I think that to that point, the Academy is actually a really great space with a lot of really good tools to use in your back pocket as you're approaching these organizations. So for instance, we actually do have some type of like ethical obligation under the IRB where we have to protect identities and we have to be really intentional about keeping people's identities private. And so I think that can be a really helpful tool as scholars are trying to approach some of these communities where they are unsure of whether they'll get access or whether they'll be trusted, to say, I do have an institutional obligation to keep you protected and private. That said, right, it is hard if you're entering a space where you feel like this is potentially problematic or subversive or antithetical, to use the language that Dr. Wagner used, to our own beliefs. That can be really hard. And so I think how you can approach these groups with a sense of curiosity and not judgment can be really helpful. There are many things in CWG that I didn't agree with that I just had to see as part of the understanding of their experience. And so I think this is something that we're having to figure out in the Academy as we go. But I think that it's better done with more listening and more understanding than it is with this kind of like totally removed and strict data about these people without actually having some type of relationship or conversation with them in turn.
I think that's really, really valuable for everyone to hear. Another question from the audience, this from Professor Alice Marwick, who says she's curious whether you think similar secret groups exist amongst conservatives, right-wing folks, and if so, in what context such groups might exist and why they might feel they have to keep their political beliefs secret. In short, do you think that there might be fundamental differences between the reasoning and motivations that would drive secret political groups on the right and on the left?
Yeah, this is a great question. And this kind of equivalency is something that's really hard to say because there's so many different elements of CWG's experience that like definitely shape their level of secrecy that potentially wouldn't be for conservatives. So I'm thinking of like, they're in a small community, they're in a rural community. Rural communities tend to be more conservative. And so that creates a dynamic where the minority is going to be a progressive or a Democrat. That being said, it doesn't mean that conservatives don't feel silenced in urban communities or feel like they're in the minority. I think that absolutely is happening. But I think the difference there is that they have more choice, more anonymity as well. Perhaps they're not identified by their car in the small town. That is absolutely the case. You drive down the street, they know that it's you. And so that lack of identifiability can be really protective of conservatives if we're thinking about that in terms of neighborhoods or environments. Now, as I published this work, I've heard from tons of other people in secret groups. So I've also been in contact with many others who are part of similar groups, both online and offline. And most of them have been Democratic and liberal. And part of that is because that's kind of what I wrote about, and so that's what it attracts. But I have had discussions with conservatives who have formed similar groups as well. And so I think that is happening. This is a phenomenon that's happening more broadly. When I look at my survey data, there's no significance of partisanship. It's not like Democrats are way more likely to have their beliefs kept a secret or join a secret group. It's both Republicans and Democrats doing these things. And so that's where potentially we need more work looking at, well, what are the contexts? If it's not that conservatives in urban communities are building these secret groups, what are the contexts where conservatives do feel silenced? Is that in a family? Is it in some other network that shapes their willingness to express themselves?
That's really helpful. Thank you. I'm going to move to the next question and really reflection on some of the things that you've said on your presentation, and even in response to the questions so far, which is coming from Professor Tressie McMillan-Cottom. She writes, I think, two things. One, that quote unquote secrecy has been conditioned by group position for a long time. Isn't that the tension in the so-called Bradley effect or desirability bias, which predates internet technologies? So given that, what should we understand how should we understand the importance of market power? That is, a lot of economic power encourages the more nefarious, secret democratic behaviors and does not incentivize the resistance. Or she asks, or she says, that's my sense. I could be wrong and would like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding the question right, this is really about how economic power and the market itself encourages secrecy in some ways. I think there's something interesting in that, right? Like, and we could totally unpack each of these fears for CWG individually. We could look at just the economic experience of feeling like if you express your beliefs, you're going to have economic retribution. What's interesting is that in the book, I follow up with some of the members who had said they were really afraid of having economic retribution for their beliefs. And in fact, your point, Tressie, is exactly right, because some of them actually ended up just saying, well, screw it. I'll just be a Democrat that only serves Democrats. And one of them actually decided that she would just create a group on Facebook for realtors that are Democrats only to serve Democratic clients. So I think like there's two things happening with this, and secrecy isn't all good, right? It has this insulatory effect and it has an incubatory effect, right? We can say when people hang together, that they insulate themselves, that they become more afraid or more judgmental or afraid of the other side. And at the same time, they can also be incubated, right? They can feel like it gives them power and they're willing to express their beliefs. And it can do both at the same time, right? For this woman, it was, I'm going to be a Democrat to my community and I'm only going to serve other Democrats. So it can do both of those things at the same time, which makes it really, really complicated, but also really, really important in understanding how people process their political identities, particularly when they feel like they're in the minority. So I'm not 100% sure that answered your question, but I think to the point of economic power in kind of encouraging secrecy, I think there is this insulation that happens with fear of economic retribution. And I definitely saw that play out over time with some of the women in the group.
So if I could maybe draw out one particular piece of the question that Professor McMillan-Cottom submitted, because I think that it can help us think through just a little bit more part of the larger debate and maybe bring us back to some of the questions about the platforms. So I'm just going to reread a specific section of that and then add on just a little bit to it. So she noted in the original message, right, that is a lot of economic power encourages the more nefarious secret democratic behaviors and does not incentivize the resistance. Now, what I'm going to add takes that and oversimplifies it and moves it to a very particular case, but I think that it nicely points to a lot of questions that we've been having in broader public discourse and that scholars have been having around the role of platforms and Facebook in particular, and thinking about the kind of underlying economic incentives that that algorithmically tethered business models encourage, such that it's the negative, it's the bad, it's the harmful actors and actions and voices that are ultimately incentivized, whereas the sort of democratic good and, as she put it, the resistance is not incentivized in the same way. Are you seeing that playing out in your analysis in this work, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely hear that point. And I'm thinking about the Stop the Steal groups. Those were some of the groups, as Facebook reported, that got some of the most traction. And so, yeah, I think there's absolutely a bias in what's celebrated on these platforms and what gets attention. And we could have a whole conversation around that. It doesn't negate the fact that there are still people using these platforms for good. But perhaps to her point, like, they're not getting the attention and they're not being highlighted, I guess, or having a lot of traction as these other groups. And so I think, to that point, these platforms absolutely are incentivizing the wrong things, but it doesn't negate the fact that there are groups on here that are using them for good. And I think we like to focus on the nefarious stuff, and rightfully we should, because it gets traction and it can have really damaging effects. We also should be looking at some of the ways that people are using these platforms for good, and how can we encourage that kind of behavior while dampening the other, perhaps more subversive behavior.
Does your work then tell us anything about what we should be asking the platforms to do in these circumstances? If the very same socio-technical infrastructures create space for good and bad, although I think many would argue they create more space for bad, unfortunately. How do we want the platforms to respond?
Yeah, and I think this is the tension that Dr. Kadam is getting at here too, which is that they have the wrong incentives and they also have the wrong approach. And this kind of harkens to your work with Dr. Shannon McGregor around who is making the decisions at these platforms, who's involved in considering these choices. We have a bunch of engineers that are making decisions about how to design a space, but we know that the social context in these communities online is very important, and that we need social scientists to be able to look at this information to say, hey, this isn't working, and we need the platforms to be responsive to us. But that's really hard when they gatekeep all of the data and won't let us access any of it, right? We have to rely on leaked internal reports to even understand what's happening in some of the worst, most anti-democratic groups. So I think to your point about, what should we say to platforms? We should say, give us access to data, help us figure out what's going on. Social scientists can be really helpful tools for you, but not only on your terms, right? It has to be a broader conversation, because what you're doing right now is not working, and it needs to change.
Thanks. We have reached the top of the hour. And Emily, I want to be respectful of your time and our audience's time. As I said a minute ago, there is so much more that we could dig into here. But indeed, the conversation will continue as a part of this conference and even beyond. Very quickly, I want to remind those in the audience that tomorrow our keynote spotlight will feature two path-breaking scholars, Dr. Khadija White and Francesca Tripodi. And so I ask that you please join us again tomorrow at 11 a.m. to hear their vital reflections. In the meantime, on behalf of GW's Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics and UNC's Center for Information Technology and Public Life, thank you to everyone for joining us today. Thank you in particular to Dr. Van Duyn for joining us. And we look forward to continuing the essential work needed to protect and preserve democracy going forward. Thank you all.